My dearest son, I'm so glad you're well. The weather's been stormy lately, but it would take the entire U.S. Navy to sink your ship. I'm patiently waiting for the day you come home to harbor. These gentle words, handwritten by a father, were the last warmth that Thomas Woodgate, the strongest man aboard the SS Mataafa, felt before he became, in the truest sense, an ice statue lying in full view of the lights of his own home. That night, the Mataafa Blow snapped 430-foot giants like twigs, while 10,000 people, 1/5 of Duluth, stood helpless on the shore, watching a public execution by nature. Nearly 30 vessels were imperiled in the storm, claiming 36 lives in a single icy breath. And to this day, it remains the most lethal, most visible, and most haunting mechanical failure in Great Lakes history. Today, we go beyond the rust and the wreckage to face the fury that turned a season of profit into a century of ghosts. Stay with me until the very end, because this is not just a story about a storm. It is a journey into the darkest depths of human choice, to uncover the hidden secrets of the shipwrecks and a final chilling truth that changed the Great Lakes forever. The tragedy of the Mataafa Blow was not a sudden act of God. It was a predicted, signaled, and witnessed catastrophe. The lake had already given its warning. 3 days before the Mataafa ever loosened its moorings, Lake Superior had unleashed a brutal preview. The wooden steamer Charlemagne had limped into the Keweenaw waterway on November 24th, looking like it had been through a war. Its railings were gone, its aft cabin was crushed into splinters, and its crew was haunted. Captain Julius F. Wolfe, Jr. later recorded the words of the Charlemagne's skipper, who told reporters he would never again be caught out at sea when he should have been safe in port. It was a clear, violent signal that the lake was in a state of upheaval. But on the Great Lakes in 1905, memory was short, and the pressure of the season was long. There was a dangerous myth whispered among the sailors of that era, a belief that Lake Superior never struck with 2 great storms in a row. As the skies cleared on November 25th, a false sense of security settled over the docks. Captains, eager to squeeze one last paycheck out of a disappointing season, rushed to set sail. They forgot the golden rule of the North. Absolute and never are words that Lake Superior does not recognize. H.W. Richardson, the forecaster at the Duluth Weather Bureau, sat in his 11-room station overlooking the lake. His equipment was primitive by our standards, but his connections via telegraph and telephone allowed him to see the monster gathering strength across the continent. On the morning of Monday, November 27th, Richardson saw a terrifying pattern on his daily charts. Dense, concentric lines, isobars, were crowding together like a tightened fist. High-pressure and low-pressure systems were colliding, and the battle line between them was heading straight for Lake Superior. In the late autumn, the atmosphere tries to balance itself. Warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico surges north, only to be ambushed by the frigid, heavy air of the Canadian Arctic. This collision creates the November gales, where winds can scream at 70 or 80 miles per hour, turning a freshwater lake into a churning cauldron of ice and death. Richardson didn't hesitate. He hoisted the Northeast storm warning flags over the pier in Duluth. The signal was red. The signal was clear. Stay in port. The Mataafa was a modern marvel of the industrial age. Launched in 1899 as the SS Pennsylvania, she was a 430-foot steel behemoth built by the Cleveland Shipping Company. To the 24 men who called her home, she was a symbol of strength. But beneath her steel skin lay a design flaw that would soon become a death trap. While the Mataafa was large, she was dangerously simple. Her engines produced a modest 1,200 horsepower, barely enough to fight the relentless suction of a November gale. More tragically, she featured a submarine stern. Her galley and aft crew quarters were housed deep within the hull, completely separated from the forward deckhouse by a series of open cargo holds. There was no internal hallway, no secret passage. To get from the warmth of the mess hall to the safety of the bridge, a sailor had to walk the open spar deck, exposed to the raw, freezing fury of the lake. In calm seas, it was a routine walk. In a storm, it was a 250-foot gauntlet of death. At the center of this world was 32-year-old Captain Richard Humble. By all accounts, Humble was a man of character, young, ambitious, and well-liked by a crew that trusted his every word. He had spent 6 years commanding vessels on these inland seas, surviving countless squalls and thick fogs. He knew the risks, but he was also a man trapped between the laws of nature and the demands of men. The Pittsburgh Steamship Company, which owned the Mataafa, maintained a careful public image. They urged their captains to use good sense and avoid undue risk. But the unspoken reality was far colder. On the Great Lakes in 1905, a captain's reputation was measured in tons of iron ore and the speed of his runs. There was a crushing, silent pressure to get in one last trip before the ice locked the harbors. Every delayed departure was a loss in profit. Every cautious wait in port was a mark against a captain's grit. On the afternoon of Monday, November 27, 1905, Captain Humble stood on the pier in Duluth. The storm warning flags were already snapping in the wind, signaling a coming northeast gale. Weather forecasting was in its infancy. There were no satellite feeds or radar loops, only the falling mercury in a barometer and the nagging intuition in a sailor's gut. Humble's barometer was higher than he would have liked, but he gambled on a window of calm. He looked at the gray horizon and convinced himself that they could beat the clock. He decided they would go. At 3:30 p.m., the Mataafa loosened her lines and steamed out of the Duluth ship channel, her hold heavy with iron ore and her stern towing the 366-foot barge James Nasmyth. Humble believed he was making a calculated decision for his career and his company. He couldn't have known that as the shore receded, he wasn't just leaving a port, he was leaving safety behind, forever. He had 24 souls under his care, and as the first snowflakes began to fall, the weight of that responsibility was about to become a burden that would haunt him until his final breath. Only hours after leaving the safety of Duluth, the western edge of Lake Superior transformed into a churning cauldron. By 7:30 p.m. on Monday, November 27th, the Mataafa was swallowed by a blinding snowstorm. By 2 a.m., the situation had turned critical. Massive waves were no longer just hitting the ship. They were surging across the deck from both sides, heavy with slush and ice, threatening to rip the wooden hatch covers from their mountings. This was the worst storm Captain Humble and his young crew had ever witnessed. By 5 a.m., a bitter reality set in. The Mataafa could not hold out much longer in the open lake. Humble called down to Chief Engineer Bill Most, demanding every ounce of power the engines could muster to steer directly into the teeth of the wind, but the ship gained not an inch. Accepting defeat against that invisible wall of air, Humble ordered the Mataafa and her barge to turn their backs to the storm and run for Duluth. They were making a desperate mad dash to return to the very port they had left less than 24 hours before. But turning a 430-foot freighter with a massive barge in tow in the middle of a November gale is a dance with death. Every degree the ship swung broadside to the wind was a moment where the lake could simply roll her over. For hours they navigated through a white void, a desperate balancing act to stay far enough from the jagged rocks, yet close enough to find the harbor. At noon on November 28th, a momentary lull in the snow revealed a ghost of a chance. Duluth appeared on the horizon. Humble intended to enter, but he knew that shooting the piers, the dangerous maneuver of entering the narrow channel, was impossible while towing the heavy James Nasmyth. With profound reluctance and fear for his crew, he signaled the barge to shorten its lines and prepare to be cut loose. Humble did not know he was about to make his second and most fatal mistake. Instead of anchoring the barge safely offshore to weather the storm, he decided to bring the Mataafa alone into the harbor's mouth, casting the Nasmyth and her crew into the void, hoping for a miracle that seemed impossible. Miraculously, that miracle arrived. The barge's anchors held, and her crew would survive the night. But for the Mataafa, the nightmare was only beginning. In our modern age of satellite, GPS, and instant communication, we forget that in 1905, a sailor was completely blind and deaf to the world around him. Communication was limited to the primitive shout of a megaphone or the mournful blast of a steam whistle. Because of this, Humble had no way of knowing that the Duluth ship channel had already become a graveyard that very day. Just hours earlier, the 363-foot steamer R.W. England had failed its entrance, ending up smashed onto the sands of Park Point. This event served as a silent death knell for the Mataafa's crew. Duluth's only life-saving crew had rushed to the far end of Minnesota Point to assist the England, leaving the northern side of the newly completed aerial ferry bridge utterly abandoned. There were no rescuers left to help the Mataafa. The warnings from the lake continued. The 478-foot ore carrier Isaac Elwood had also attempted to run for it. In a terrifying display of the lake's power, the Elwood was tossed like a toy, slamming into the North Pier, bouncing off the South Pier, and eventually sinking in the shallow water of the harbor. The lake was sending a message. The gates are closed. But Humble, unaware and desperate, pressed on. The Mataafa's meager luck, which had kept her afloat through the night, had run dry. Humble aimed his prow at the narrow gap between the two stone piers of the Duluth ship channel. Success required perfect timing and absolute precision, but Lake Superior had no intention of showing mercy. The freighter was halfway into the channel when a monstrous wave lifted her stern high into the air. The force drove her prow downward, grinding it violently into the lake bottom. Before Humble could regain control, the pivoting stern slammed into the North Pier. The impact was catastrophic. The rudder was sheared off completely. The Mataafa was now a 430-foot leaf in a hurricane. Powerless and unsteerable, she was sucked back out toward the open lake before her stern smashed into the South Pier. In the engine room, Bill Mosh shouted the final chilling words to his men. "It's all up, boys," as they fled the flooding compartment. The ship drifted for a few harrowing moments before grounding just outside the North Pier, sitting perpendicular to the shore. The lake was not finished. Every wave now smashed over the crippled vessel with the weight of a falling mountain. A massive crack formed at hatch number 8, and with the sound of screaming metal, the Mataafa split in two. The water around the wreck turned a haunting red as her cargo of iron ore spilled into the surf, a bleeding wound in the gray water. The Mataafa ran aground about 100 feet from the North Pier and about 700 feet from the beach, close enough to see the fires lit by the people of Duluth, yet trapped in an icy hell that no one could reach. The Mataafa's submarine-like design now revealed its horror, as 24 men were split into two separate worlds. Those in the bow had minimal protection from the pilot house, but for the 9 souls trapped in the stern, the situation was catastrophic. As the engine room flooded, the boilers went cold. No heat, no light, only the sound of waves crushing the stern deeper into the icy depths. The crew quarters at the stern were partially submerged in below-zero water. To remain there was to wait for a death sealed in ice. Recognizing the inevitable, 4 men chose to gamble their lives on a 75-meter journey across the exposed deck to reach the forward cabin. Among them were second mate Herbert Imai, fireman Charlie Byrne, steward Fred Saunders, and the strongest man on the ship, fireman Thomas Woodgate. Herbert Imai led the way. He stood at the edge of the abyss, watching the rhythm of the lake. He counted the seconds between the massive rollers that swept the deck. When the water receded, he dropped to all fours, clinging to the wire rail with frozen fingers. Every time a wave hit, he shielded his head and braced against the slush-thick water. Inch by inch, he crawled through the driftwood and wreckage. 4 times the lake tried to claim him. 4 times he held on. Finally, Wally Brown reached out from the forward deckhouse and pulled his friend to safety. Imai signaled for the others to follow. Fred Saunders, the small porter, went next. 10,000 people on the Duluth shore, nearly 1/5 of the city's entire population, held their collective breath. They watched through spyglasses and squinted through the snow as the small figure was slammed into the deck by a wall of water. The crowd cheered as Saunders rose again, refusing to let go. After the 4th wave, he too was pulled into the warmth of the forward house. Then came Thomas Woodgate. The crowd on the shore felt a surge of hope when they saw his large, muscular frame step out. If anyone could survive this, it was Woodgate. He followed the rhythm. He braced. But the lake seemed to target him with a calculated cruelty. A massive wave swept over the rail and pulled him over the side. With Herculean strength, Woodgate grabbed the rail and hauled himself back onto the deck. He moved forward again, only to be dragged over a second time. Again, he recovered. But the 3rd wave was the decider. It threw him against the steel plates of the ship, smashing his head. Dazed, bleeding, and exhausted, the strongest man on the Mataafa realized the lake had won. He retreated back to the stern, back to the 9 men who were now resigned to their fate. Charlie Byrne was the last to try. He watched, he waited, and by some miracle of timing or luck, he made it across. He was the last man to bridge the gap. Chief Engineer Bill Most stood at the edge, but seeing Woodgate's failure, he knew his own strength would not suffice. The ship was now truly divided. 15 men in the bow, 9 in the stern. Only 250 feet of deck separated them, but they might as well have been on different planets. On the shore, the frustration was boiling over. The bonfires lit by the citizens of Duluth cast an eerie, flickering light over the ship channel. They could see the men, they could hear the megaphone cries of Captain Humble begging for help. But the U.S. life-saving service was paralyzed. Their only crew had been occupied miles away at the wreck of the R.W. England. By the time Murdoch McLennan and his men arrived, 2 hours and 45 minutes had passed since the Mataafa first struck the pier. The lake was too rough to launch a surfboat. The Mataafa's own lifeboats had long ago been reduced to splinters. The rescuers turned to the Lyle gun, a small cannon designed to fire a lifeline over the wreck to establish a breeches buoy. They fired. The first line missed. The second line landed on an inaccessible part of the hull. The third line finally hit the forward deck house, but before the sailors could grasp it, the wet rope froze solid, turning into a rigid, useless rod of ice. For 5 agonizing hours, the life-saving crew tried to bridge the gap. But by 10 p.m., the darkness and the cold had rendered their efforts impossible. The rescuers on the shore were forced to stop. They retreated to the bonfires, leaving the men on the Mataafa to face the night alone. The darkness enveloping the Mataafa was absolute, broken only by the distant, flickering bonfires on the Duluth shore. Those fires, meant to provide a beacon of hope, were in reality a cruel, taunting irony to the men trapped on the wreck. They were stranded a mere 700 feet from warmth, yet they were imprisoned in a cathedral of ice and screaming wind. The temperature had plummeted to a lethal 12 degrees below zero. Inside the forward deck house, 15 men were losing the agonizing battle against exhaustion. Captain Richard Humble, despite the weight of his own failing judgment, knew the brutal law of the North. In this level of cold, to sleep was to surrender to death. The captain found deckhand. Harry Larson slumped in a corner of the room, his head drooping as his body began the slow shutdown of hypothermia. Humble did not offer a gentle touch. He jostled the young man violently awake, commanding every man to stay on their feet. In the eerie, shimmering light of the distant shore fires that filtered through the frosted glass, the 15 survivors began a strange, macabre, slow-motion dance. They swayed from side to side, jumped in place, and swung their arms in a desperate rhythm to keep their blood flowing. But as the 60-mile-per-hour winds ripped through the windows and doors smashed by the waves, the crippled ship became a literal icebox. Every surface, the walls, the floor, the men's own hair, was coated in a thick, translucent layer of rime. Humble realized that movement alone would not sustain them through the long hours until dawn. He looked at his crew, their faces crusted with salt and frost, and knew he had to commit a final act of desperation to save the lives remaining in his care. He waded into the flooded lower quarters, where the floor was submerged under 3 feet of freezing, red-tinted slush. He scavenged with the intensity of a man possessed. He found a jar of kerosene, a few dry matches, and some rags. Then, seizing a hatchet, he went from room to room, smashing the very furniture that had provided comfort just a day before. He chopped up mahogany desks, chairs, and wood paneling, the fragments of a civilization being consumed to ward off the wild. In the center of the captain's quarters, he dragged his own heavy bathtub. He filled it with the wood scraps, doused the heap with kerosene, and struck a match. It was a small flickering orange flame in a world of oppressive white and gray. But it was everything. The 15 men crowded around the bathtub, shielding the fire with their freezing bodies, creating a human wall against the drafts. They huddled in the strange, flickering glow of kerosene lamps and the scrapwood fire, listening to the lake scream outside like a wounded animal. Every time a massive wave slammed into the hull, sending a shudder through the broken ship, the men would scramble to the other side of the room to avoid the freezing spray that hissed through the cracks. They fought for every minute, every breath, until the pre-dawn light of Wednesday morning finally began to bleed through the heavy clouds. At 7:30 a.m., the storm finally relented. Humble stepped out onto the ice-slicked deck and saw a U.S. life-saving lifeboat rowing toward them through the heavy, subsiding surf. A wave of relief washed over him. Their icy hell was ending. But as he turned his hollowed eyes toward the stern, his heart sank into the abyss. There was no movement, no smoke, only silence. When the lifesavers arrived, they performed the grueling task of evacuating the 15 survivors from the bow. But the duty was not yet done. Captain Humble and First Mate Wally Brown, despite their bone-deep exhaustion, knew they had to check on the 9 men left behind in the aft section. The spar deck was no longer a walkway. It was a 250-foot treacherous bridge of jagged ice. Because of the frozen incline, they had to crawl on their hands and knees across the very path where Thomas Woodgate had fought his losing battle. As they neared the smokestack in the stern, their worst fears were realized in the most gruesome fashion. On the port side of the deck, they found the first set of bodies. They were encased in so much ice that they didn't look like men anymore. They were faceless pillars of white, chiseled into the ship's structure by the spray. They found deckhand Thomas McLeod huddled inside a metal ventilator, a desperate attempt at shelter that the cold had turned into a tomb. Then, they found the body of Thomas Woodgate. Woodgate, the strongest man on the Mataafa, the fireman who had defied the lake 3 times and almost reached the bow, was now a frozen monument. He was found near the stern, his muscular frame preserved by the frost. When they finally pried his body from the ice, they discovered a sodden piece of paper tucked deep in his pocket. It was a letter from his father, H.W. Woodgate, dated November 17th. The words on that paper were a haunting, prophetic echo. His father had written, "My dear son, I'm so glad you are well. The weather has been stormy lately, but since it would take the entire U.S. Navy to sink the old Kensington, I am sure you are safe and well. I am patiently waiting until the time comes and you reach port at 130 Harbord Street. With all the love from your affectionate father." The lake had cruelly mocked that father's confidence. It had taken the strongest man and turned him into a statue of grief. They found the others soon after: Chief Engineer Bill Most and Steward Henry Wright. 3 others, William Gilchrist, C.A. Farringer, and James Early, were never found, swept into the red, iron-filled depths of the lake. It took the recovery teams hours to remove the remains. The cold had fused the men to the steel. They had to be chiseled free with hammers and spikes, a sound of metal on ice that haunted the witnesses for decades. The Mataafa disaster became the deadliest and most visible casualty of the 1905 storm. It had played out like a stage play in front of 10,000 witnesses, nearly 1/5 of Duluth's population. For Captain Richard Humble, there was no light strong enough to guide him out of his own darkness. Although there was no official investigation that stripped him of his rank, Humble conducted a private trial within his own soul every single day. He never forgot the afternoon of November 27th when he chose to ignore the flags. He never forgave himself for the 9 men who turned to ice in the stern while he burned furniture in the bow. For the rest of his life, he suffered from chronic, agonizing ulcers, the physical manifestation of a conscience that could find no harbor. He returned to the lakes and captained 5 more vessels, but the man who had left Duluth in 1905 never truly came back. He died at the age of only 43, leaving behind his wife Jessie and 3 children under the age of 10. His oldest, Bernice, had been born only weeks before the disaster. The storm didn't just take 9 lives that night, it took 10. It took the life Richard Humble was supposed to live, leaving him to wander the Great Lakes as a ghost of his own making, until his heart finally surrendered to the weight of the ice. While the Mataafa was fighting a dramatic, solitary battle at the Duluth harbor, it was in fact only one act in a theater filled with widespread slaughter. Miles away, hidden behind the same blinding curtain of snow, another tragedy was unfolding. The steamship William Edinburgh and its companion, the barge Madeira. To understand their fate, you must understand the deceptive calm that lured them into this graveyard. At noon on November 26, 1905, the Edinburgh and Madeira passed through the Sulaks. The sky was an innocent blue, and the water was a glass-like mirror. They were heading west, light in the water, carrying only ballast to fetch one final load of iron ore before the winter freeze. For the crew, it felt like a routine run, a quiet end to a long season. But Lake Superior was merely catching its breath, drawing in the cold Arctic air required to fuel a monster. By dinner time the next day, the world had turned upside down. The barometer didn't just fall, it collapsed. The wind suddenly shifted, howling from the northeast at a steady 100 kilometers per hour. First, mate William F. Hormig would later recall that the snow did not simply fall, it attacked. It fell with such savage, horizontal intensity that it was physically impossible to look into the teeth of the storm for even a second. In an era without GPS radar or satellite navigation, these men were effectively blind. They were navigating by ghost math and gut instinct. Captain A.J. Talbot gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, trying to hold a steady compass course. Southwest, then southwest by south, but the gale was a physical force pushing against the very soul of the ship. For 12 unrelenting hours, they fought. The winds were no longer just a breeze. They were a wall. In the open water, gusts shrieked up to 80 miles per hour, creating waves that looked like moving mountains of black glass topped with jagged white foam. Blinded by the whiteout, the crew had no idea that the currents and the wind had conspired to blow them miles off course. They thought they were clearing Devil's Island in the Apostles. In reality, they were charging headfirst toward the jagged black obsidian cliffs of the Minnesota North Shore. At 3:30 a.m. on November 28th, the nightmare peaked. Amidst the deafening roar of the waves and the howling wind, a sound like a high-powered rifle shot rang out across the water. The massive steel tow line, thick enough to hold a skyscraper, had snapped under the tension. In an instant, the Madeira, a barge with no engines and no way to steer, was cast adrift into the black void. The Edinburgh lurched forward, suddenly freed of her 3,000-ton burden, but the relief was short-lived. Captain Talbot later testified that the snow was so thick they couldn't see half the length of their own deck. The Madeira had vanished into the scream of the storm. As the Edenborn spun in the chaos, Talbot faced a captain's ultimate agony: hesitation. To turn too quickly in such high seas risked a broach, rolling the ship over and sending everyone to the bottom in seconds. Somewhere behind them, in the gloom, the Madeira was drifting towards certain destruction. After an hour of desperate, blind searching, Talbot ordered the ship to turn, a suicidal maneuver that exposed their broadside to the full, unbridled force of the wind. Inside the bowels of the ship, Chief Engineer Silas H. Hunter heard a thunderous crash that vibrated through his boots. He feared the broken tow line had fouled the propeller, leaving them dead in the water. To check, he had to leave the warmth of the engine room and step into the hellscape above. He didn't walk, he crawled. He moved across the deck on his hands and knees, the wind trying to peel his fingernails back, shielding his face from the stinging sleet that felt like broken glass. He clung to skylights and iron railings, watching the lake spill over the sides in solid, green blocks of water just to keep from being blown into the abyss. But the Edenborn wasn't headed for open water. With a sickening, metallic crunch that drowned out the storm, she struck the shore half a mile south of Split Rock. She didn't hit a soft sandbar. She slammed into solid rock. The impact was so violent that when the snow momentarily cleared, the crew realized they weren't in the lake anymore. They were in the woods. Trees were looming over the side of the ship, their branches scraping against the steel hull. The ship began to break apart almost immediately as the waves used the rocks like a hammer. It was here that the first life was claimed by the Mataafa Blow. Third Engineer James Johnson had a habit that would prove fatal. He liked to walk across the wooden hatch covers to move along the ship, a practice the captain had forbidden. In the blinding whiteout, Johnson stepped out into the dark. He reached for hatch number 9, but the lake had already claimed the cover. He stepped into a hole that led 40 feet down into the dark, churning hold. He was killed instantly, his body lost in the shifting ballast. 3 others fell into different hatches in the chaos but were miraculously pulled back by their gasping crewmates. The survivors huddled in the freezing remains of the cabins until the tug Edna G., a legendary vessel in her own right, arrived to ferry them and Johnson's broken body back to Two Harbors. But what of the Madeira? Cast off and powerless, Captain John Dissett signaled frantically with his whistle, but the Edenborn was gone. He ordered the anchors dropped. 900 feet of heavy iron chain hissed into the black water, but the lake bottom here was smooth rock. The anchors could find no grip. The Madeira drifted, a ghost ship in a snowstorm, until she smashed into a 75-foot vertical cliff 2 miles northeast of Split Rock. The stern swung around with the force of a wrecking ball, slamming against the sheer stone until the ship snapped in two like a dry bone. The crew was divided. 4 men in the bow, 5 in the stern. They looked up and saw a wall of sheer rock so high the top was lost in the swirling snow. They were trapped in a vertical prison. In desperation, First Mate John Marrow saw a mast swaying near the cliff edge as the ship ground against the stone. He climbed upward, his frozen hands slipping on the wood, hoping to leap to the safety of a ledge. But the ship shifted. A rogue wave hit, and Marrow was swept into the freezing surf. He vanished instantly. Then, out of the terror, a hero emerged. Sailor Fred Benson, a man the Duluth Evening Herald would later describe as a Scandinavian giant with the arms of Hercules, refused to wait for death. He grabbed a coil of rope and stood at the edge of the shattered deck. As a massive surge tilted the broken ship toward the cliff face, Benson made a leap of pure, unadulterated desperation. He landed on a narrow, ice-slicked ledge halfway up the cliff. clinging to the frozen rock like a human squirrel, Benson began to climb. He had no safety gear, no warm clothes, only the raw will to live. He climbed 75 feet of vertical, ice-covered stone, while the waves battered his legs and the wind tried to rip him from the wall. Against every law of physics and probability, Benson reached the summit. He weighted a small line with a stone and dropped it back down to his dying comrades. One by one, he hauled 4 men up that cliff. Then, using a heavier line, he rescued the remaining crew from the other half of the ship. They stood on the cliff top, shivering, bleeding, and exhausted. But they were alive. They wandered through the frozen forest for hours until they found the small hut of a fisherman named Nick Hansen, who shared his meager food and warmth with the frostbitten survivors. The Madeira survivors eventually reached safety, but the lake wasn't done. Down the coast, the Lafayette and her barge Manila suffered the same fate. Captain D.P. Wright watched as his ship was lifted 30 feet into the air by a surge and slammed into the rocks like an eggshell. The Lafayette snapped in two, crushing a fireman between the steel hull and the unyielding Minnesota stone. During the Mataafa Storm of 1905, the SS Ira H. Owen and its 14 crew members vanished without a trace near the Apostle Islands. Some have reported seeing it as a ghost ship. That night, the north shore of Minnesota seemed fiercely cursed. The lake swept away, wrecked or damaged 11 vessels from Split Rock to Park Point in Duluth. The Mataafa Blow left a scar on the Great Lakes that never truly healed, but from the frozen wreckage, a legacy of safety was born. The cries of 36 fallen sailors reached the halls of Congress, leading to the construction of the iconic Split Rock Lighthouse in 1910, a silent sentinel built to ensure no other captain would be blinded by the North Shore's jagged teeth. Rescue protocols were overhauled, mandating life-saving crews on both sides of the Duluth Canal and the installation of lifeline cables running from bow to stern, a simple change that could have saved the men of the Mataafa. Today, a century of progress has replaced megaphones with satellite GPS and primitive barometers with electronic forecasting. Yet, the ghost of 1905 still lingers. Even with our modern steel and silicon, when Lake Superior churns in the dark of November, there is no absolute guarantee of safety. The lake remains a sovereign power, reminding us that technology can fail, but the weight of a captain's decision is eternal. As the gales howl, we remember the Mataafa, not just as a tragedy, but as a testament to the fragile line between human ambition and the untamable fury of the deep. Finally, before I close today's message, thank you for journeying back to the frozen shores of 1905 with me. We have walked the ice-slicked decks of the Mataafa and felt the snap of the Madeira's tow line, reminding us that Lake Superior never truly sleeps. If you have your own stories of the Great Lakes or a maritime mystery that haunts you, please share them in the comments. I read every single one. If this journey moved you, consider liking, sharing, and following for our next deep dive into the abyss. Until then, remember the weight of the ice and the cost of a final run. I'll see you in the next story on the channel.